I'm the storyteller, and my stories must be told. I have many stories, tales for both the young and old. I have many voices to describe many places. Many names have I, and many faces. In Russia I am Ivan, in Sweden I am Jan. In Germany I'm Johann, in America I'm John. From my many travels I have gathered these tales to teach you good sense when all else fails. Sometimes there are tears, sometimes there is laughter, but always a happily ever after.
Long ago and far away across the sea, there once stood a tumble-down old cottage. Here lived a poor widow with her only daughter, Bridget. The widow worked from dawn to dusk to keep the cottage clean, while her daughter did nothing but lie in bed all day, dreaming her life away. For Bridget was the prettiest but the laziest girl in all the land. One day, the poor widow decided to teach her lazy daughter a lesson. So this time, when she came to wake Bridget, she cried out, "Today you will work, my girl. You will clean the room and cook the porridge." "Yes, mother," sighed the lazy girl. The widow had to go and work for a neighbour, so she gave Bridget strict instructions not to burn the porridge, for there was nothing else to eat. Bridget, still sleepy-eyed, had no wish to do any housework, but having seen her mother so cross, she thought she'd better try. She did so hate cleaning that she decided to cook the porridge first. So she stoked up the fire and then threw the last of the meal into the pot. Lazily, she began to stir the porridge, and soon she was having a wonderful daydream. She dreamt of marrying a handsome prince and living in a fine castle where she would never have to work. She was dreaming so hard the spoon dropped from her lazy fingers. Bridget was so far, far away, dreaming of all the fine dresses she would wear, that she did not see the pot begin to burn. Soon, black smoke was billowing up from the pot, when who should return but the widow. She was so angry with Bridget for burning the porridge that she chased her out of the house with a broom. Now it so happened that the prince of the land came riding by. The prince had seen the widow beating Bridget, so he reined up his horse and said, "Widow, why were you beating that girl?" As Bridget gazed up at the handsome prince, the widow thought quickly and said, "She is my daughter, prince. She spends all day spinning, weaving and knitting. I have to beat her to stop her working." The girl was surely the loveliest the prince had ever seen, and he had vowed that he would marry the prettiest girl in the land. So he said, "Widow, your daughter is then not only the prettiest, but also the most hard-working girl in the land." The widow smiled, too ashamed to tell the prince of her daughter's laziness. "It pleases me greatly," said the prince, For the Queen has forbidden me to marry a lazy girl. I shall take your daughter to be my bride." Bridget could not believe it. Her dream was coming true. The prince was taking her away to his castle. In great excitement, she mounted up behind the prince, and he tossed a bag of gold down to the widow, saying, "Take this gift for the loss of your daughter." The prince and Bridget rode over many a hill and dale until they at last arrived at the castle. Bridget had never in her life seen anything quite so grand, and she felt very shy. But the prince led her into the castle, where the king and queen were waiting. "Mother, be happy. I have found the perfect bride." The queen looked at Bridget and said, "Pretty she be, but how do you know she is hard-working?" "Because her mother told me," said the prince. "I caught her beating the girl because she would not stop working." The queen was not impressed. "My foolish son, no one gets beaten for working. Tonight she may sleep, but tomorrow I will send her to work." So that night, Bridget slept between silken sheets. At dawn, who should appear beside the bed but the cold and haughty queen? The queen was quite sure that Bridget was a lazy girl, but she had to prove it. Bridget awoke at the queen's icy touch. She thought she was still dreaming until she saw the queen's stern face. "Today we shall see how well you work," said the queen very coldly. "First you may eat, and then you will come with me." Bridget ate her breakfast with a heavy heart. When she was ready, the queen led her out of the turret. Down, down they went, deeper and deeper into the castle. Until at last they came to a door. Bridget entered a small room, and what she saw made her heart sink. "Spin all that flax into thread by dusk, or you shall not marry my son." Then the queen left, locking the door behind her. Poor Bridget. What was she going to do? For though her mother had often tried to teach her to spin, she would never learn. How she wished she hadn't been so lazy. She had fallen in love with the handsome prince, and now, because she could not spin, she wouldn't be allowed to marry him. Bridget was sobbing her heart out, when suddenly there came a great flash and a tiny old lady appeared from nowhere. She was dressed in green and looked very friendly. But Bridget could not help noticing that one of her feet was extremely large. The old lady hurried over to where Bridget was sitting and said kindly, "Why do you weep so? Are you unhappy?" "Yes," cried Bridget, "for I will lose the prince if I do not spin all this flax by nightfall." "Do you love him very much?" "If he was but a beggar, I'd love him." "Then I will spin the flax for you, if you make me a promise." Bridget agreed, and the old lady quickly shooed her out of the way. Then she sat down and began to spin. Bridget had never seen anyone in her whole life spin as fast as the old lady did. On and on she spun, until Bridget grew quite dizzy watching the wheel turn. And as she spun, the old lady sang this strange song. "Put on the treadles, work faster than light, spin all the flax before it is night. I'll have my promise when the work's done, to the princess own wedding I shall then come." and on spun the old lady. Bridget did not know who she was or where she came from, but she knew there was something very special about her. Round and round flew the spindle as the old lady continued to spin, and the mound of flax went down and down. Until, at last, all the flax had gone, and there before her was a great pile of thread. "Don't forget your promise now." "I won't." And in a flash the old lady had gone. Bridget was sad to see her go, but happy that her task was all done. When the Queen unlocked the door that night and saw that all the flax had gone, she was very surprised. "I see you can spin," said the Queen, with a tiny smile. Bridget was so happy, for she had not lost the prince after all. She was invited to dine at the royal table that night. The king was in good humour, and Bridget found him very jolly. But she still felt very frightened of the Queen. She knew that the Queen would do everything she could to stop the prince marrying a lazy girl like her. And sure enough, the next morning, the Queen set Bridget a second task. This time it was to knit a great mound of wool by nightfall. "If you fail, you shall not marry my son," said the Queen coldly. And with a cruel smile, she left the room. Poor Bridget. She was very upset, for she did not know how to knit either. How she wished she had listened to her mother. She felt so ashamed of her laziness. Bravely she tried to knit, but it was no good. She just fumbled and dropped every stitch. Again she began to weep when there was a great flash, and who should appear but another tiny old lady. Bridget started, but the old lady seemed very friendly. She was dressed all in blue, and Bridget couldn't help noticing that her nose was extremely long. The old lady wanted to know why Bridget was crying, so Bridget told her about the prince and how she would never be able to marry him now because she could not knit. The old lady told her that she would knit all the wool if Bridget made her a promise. Bridget agreed, so the old lady shooed her off the chair and took her place before the great mound of wool. Bridget watched as the old lady began to knit. Faster and faster she went. Bridget had never seen anyone knit quite so fast. Nose on the needle, work faster than light, or the wool must be gone before it is night. I'll have my promise when the work's done. To the prince's own wedding I shall then come. At last, the old lady had finished. And as Bridget wound up the knitting, the old lady cried, "Don't forget your promise now. Invite me to the wedding." And with a wave, she was gone. How happy Bridget was, for the old lady had knitted every last strand of wool. The Queen Queen appeared that evening, and was most surprised to see that all the wool had gone. "Well, I see you can knit." But Bridget's troubles were not yet over. For the next morning, the Queen led her again to the small room. "Weave all that thread by nightfall, or back to your mother you go." Then away she went, sure that this time Bridget would never complete her task. Poor Bridget was in despair, for she had never learned to weave and had no idea how to work the loom. She tried and tried, but it was no good. Now she would lose the prince most surely, and have to return to her mother in disgrace. Poor Bridget was crying her heart out when there was a flash, and this time it was a tiny old lady in red. As the old lady waved to her, Bridget could not help noticing that her arms were extremely long. The old lady hurried over to her. "Why are you crying?" "Because if I don't weave all this thread, the Queen will not let me marry the prince." "Cheer up. I will weave the thread for you." "Will you really?" "Yes, if you will make me a promise." Bridget happily agreed, and so the old lady went over to the loom. Bridget watched as the old lady began to weave. Faster and faster flew the shuttle, until Bridget felt quite dizzy just watching it. As the old lady continued to weave, she sang this lilting song. "Arms on the shuttle work faster than light. Weave all the cloth before it is night. I'll have my promise when the work's done. To the prince's own wedding I shall then come." At last, all of it had gone, and there was the cloth, all ready to be folded. "Remember your promise, Bridget. Invite me to the wedding." Then, in a flash, the old lady had gone. Bridget was overjoyed. The Queen would never be able to send her away now. And when the Queen arrived that night, she was indeed most pleased. "Well done. You have worked hard. You shall marry my son." Bridget could not believe it. At last, her dearest wish was coming true. The wedding day came, and after the ceremony, there was a great feast, to which all the nobles of the land were invited. The young couple looked radiantly happy. The king told everyone to be seated, and the guests took their places. Every chair was taken, except for 3, in front of the royal table that remained mysteriously empty. Just as the guests began to eat, there came a knock at the door, and who should appear but the old lady in green. She walked boldly up to the royal table. "Who invited you to the wedding?" asked the king crossly.
"The bride did, Your Majesty."
"Welcome then, but tell me, how came you by that giant foot?"
"From 100 years of it on the treadle."
This the prince cried out, "Then my bride shall never spin again." So the king waved the old lady to be seated, and away she went to one of the empty chairs. She was pleased with Bridget for keeping her promise. The king had just begun his dinner again when who should appear in the hall but the old lady in blue. "And who invited you to the wedding?"
bride, did Your Majesty?
Oh, very well. But tell me, how came you by such a long nose?
From 100 years of knitting needles hitting my nose.
Then my bride shall never knit again, cried the prince angrily. The king waved the old lady to be seated, and away she went, and sat down beside the other old lady. The king was just wishing that he could enjoy his food in peace, when who should appear but the little lady in red. I suppose the bride invited you too.
That's right, Your Majesty.
Oh, very well. Tell me, how came you by such long arms?
From 100 years working the shuttle.
Then my bride shall never weave again, cried the prince. The king waved the old lady to be seated. All he wanted was to be left in peace to eat his dinner, and he did so hope no other old ladies were going to turn up. The banquet began once more. The king was now in great humour, and kept making Bridget laugh at his funny stories. And the prince's good humour returned. Now he was sure his bride wouldn't have to work all day. Only the queen remained silent, for she was thinking that a bride with the blessing of the fairy folk was 100 times more precious than a hard-working one. So it all ended happily. Bridget and her prince lived on together in harmony at the castle. And, much to the queen's surprise, Bridget turned into a very hard-working girl. She learned how to cook and weave and sew, and was a great help to the queen. But the prince remembered the words of the fairy folk, and made sure that Bridget did not work too hard, so that they had plenty of time to spend together.